One of the biggest questions surrounding the Pittsburgh Steelers right now isn't who will start, who will shine, or even how far this team can go during the upcoming season. Instead, one of the most fascinating storylines developing after OTAs is which players currently on the roster may not even be around when Week 1 arrives. As training camp in Latrobe gets closer, the Steelers are approaching the point of the offseason where difficult roster decisions begin to take shape. Every year, surprising names emerge as potential cut candidates, and this year may be no different. While some roster battles are expected, others are beginning to gain attention because of how crowded certain position groups have become. The quarterback room is the perfect place to start. The Steelers appear set at the top of the depth chart, with Aaron Rodgers expected to lead the offense. Behind him, however, an interesting battle is forming between Mason Rudolph and Will Howard. The reality is that Pittsburgh is unlikely to carry 4 quarterbacks on the active roster. In a season where every roster spot matters, especially for a team trying to maximize depth across both sides of the football, keeping multiple quarterbacks who may never see the field becomes difficult to justify. That creates a direct competition. Will Howard enters camp as a young quarterback with developmental upside. Mason Rudolph, meanwhile, brings experience and familiarity. The battle may ultimately come down to one simple question: how close is Howard to being game ready? If Howard performs well during training camp and the preseason, the Steelers could decide that his long-term potential makes him the better choice. After all, if the rookie can show he is capable of stepping into a game if needed, Pittsburgh may prefer investing in a younger player rather than relying on a veteran backup whose role is already well established. The importance of this competition becomes even greater when considering Aaron Rodgers' age. Injuries are always unpredictable in the NFL, and every team must be prepared for unexpected situations. If the Steelers believe Howard can handle those responsibilities, the quarterback room could look very different by the end of the summer. But quarterback isn't the only position where difficult decisions are emerging. The running back room has become increasingly crowded, and that brings attention to Caleb Johnson. The situation surrounding Johnson is particularly interesting because the roster around him has changed significantly. The Steelers added Rico Dowdle, brought in special teams contributor Travis Homer, and also added Eli Heidenreich, a versatile player capable of contributing in multiple ways. As a result, Johnson faces an important challenge. Finding a clear role within the offense may not be enough. He may also need to prove his value on special teams if he wants to secure a roster spot. What's particularly notable is that coaching staffs often prioritize players who fit their current vision. If the organization determines that Johnson isn't the ideal fit for what they want offensively, questions about his future could become very real. And because he remains a young player with potential, there may be teams around the league willing to show interest if Pittsburgh ever decided to move on from him. Meanwhile, another roster battle is quietly developing along the offensive line. Ryan McCollum has spent time serving as a backup center for the Steelers, but the depth chart around him is becoming more competitive. Pittsburgh now has several offensive linemen capable of handling center duties if needed. Spencer Anderson provides flexibility. Mason McCormick offers another option in emergency situations. Most importantly, Brock Hoffman enters the picture as a player capable of providing interior line versatility. That flexibility could make roster decisions extremely difficult. If Hoffman secures a role as a backup guard and center, Pittsburgh could potentially save a valuable roster spot elsewhere. In a league where versatility often determines who stays and who goes, McCollum finds himself facing one of the toughest competitions of his Steelers career. Then there is the defensive line. Dean Lowry recently returned to the Steelers, but his path to the final roster is far from guaranteed. The defensive front has seen new additions, competition continues to increase, and Lowry is also working his way back after dealing with a significant injury. Experience helps his case, but roster spots are earned every summer, not awarded based on previous seasons. At the same time, several younger players are attempting to establish themselves and force the coaching staff into difficult conversations. And that's where things become even more interesting, because some of the most talked about names among Steelers fans may soon find themselves fighting for their NFL futures once training camp begins. The next group of players includes fan favorites, recent additions, and young prospects who each bring unique traits to the roster, but none of them can afford a slow summer. As camp approaches, the pressure is only increasing, and some of the most surprising roster decisions may still be ahead. Which of these battles do you believe will have the biggest impact on the Steelers' final 53-man roster? One of the names generating the most interest among Steelers fans is Sebastian Castro. He may not be the biggest player on the roster, and he may not possess elite physical traits, but he has built a reputation as a smart football player who understands the game at a high level. Those qualities have earned him plenty of support from fans who appreciate players willing to outwork opponents and maximize every opportunity. However, intelligence alone doesn't guarantee a roster spot in the NFL. The safety room remains competitive, and Pittsburgh could still explore additional veteran options. If the Steelers decide they need more experience or more physical upside at the position, Castro could find himself battling for one of the final roster spots. The coaching staff undoubtedly values players who understand assignments and communicate effectively, but they also need athletes capable of matching up against some of the league's most explosive offenses. That's why Castro's training camp performance could become one of the more closely watched stories this summer. Even if he doesn't make the initial 53-man roster, he is the type of player who could remain in the organization's plans through the practice squad. Still, nothing will be handed to him. Another player facing an important summer is Dante Cansey. Injuries limited his opportunities last season, and now he enters a training camp where every rep matters. The challenge for Cansey is simple: prove that he belongs in the plans of the current coaching staff. Whenever changes occur within an organization, players often have to reestablish themselves. Previous evaluations matter less than what coaches see today. For Cansey, consistency will be critical. The Steelers have continued adding talent and depth throughout the roster, and players who fail to separate themselves can quickly find themselves falling behind. Camp will provide him with a fresh opportunity, but it will also provide direct competition from players eager to earn those same snaps. Then there is Gabriel Rubio, one of the more intriguing developmental players on the roster. Rubio projects as a big-bodied defensive lineman capable of helping against the run. That type of player always carries value, especially in a division known for physical football. But projection and production are two different things. The Steelers need to see what Rubio can do when the intensity rises during camp practices and preseason games. There are legitimate questions surrounding his development. He is coming off a significant injury, and his path to a roster spot is far from guaranteed. Training camp often reveals which young players are ready for the next level and which players need more time. Rubio's performance in Latrobe could ultimately determine whether he earns a place on the roster or continues his development elsewhere within the organization. Perhaps one of the most fascinating evaluations belongs to Robert Spillane Jennings. Physically, there's a lot to like. Speed stands out immediately. Athletic ability is obvious. The raw tools are there, and that is exactly why the Steelers are interested in developing him. The challenge, however, is transforming those physical gifts into reliable football performance. For young defensive backs, the mental side of the game is often the biggest hurdle. Understanding responsibilities, recognizing offensive concepts, taking proper angles, and reacting quickly all become essential at the NFL level. Athleticism can get a player noticed, but discipline is what keeps him on the field. That is why Jennings may represent one of the most important developmental projects on the roster. If the coaching staff believes he is absorbing instruction, improving his awareness, and becoming a trustworthy option on defense and special teams, his chances of making the team increase dramatically. If not, the Steelers may determine that additional development time is needed. Then we arrive at a player who has quickly become a fan favorite despite the challenges ahead of him: Eli Heidenreich. There is a lot to like about Heidenreich's skill set. His versatility makes him unique, and fans have embraced the possibility of seeing him carve out a role in Pittsburgh's offense. The problem isn't necessarily talent. The problem is opportunity. The running back room is crowded. Every roster spot is valuable, and when multiple players are competing for similar responsibilities, difficult decisions become unavoidable. Heidenreich's challenge is finding a role that nobody else can provide. If he can establish himself as a special teams contributor or demonstrate a unique offensive package that benefits the team, his chances improve significantly. But if the coaching staff determines that other players can fill those responsibilities more effectively, he could become one of the most surprising names left off the final roster. What makes this situation particularly difficult for fans is that roster decisions are rarely based on popularity. Coaches evaluate fit, versatility, depth, special teams value, and future potential. Sometimes talented players simply become victims of numbers, and that's exactly what makes this year's roster battles so compelling. As training camp approaches, the Steelers are entering a phase where reputations no longer matter as much as performance. Every practice, every preseason snap, every special teams rep, and every opportunity to impress could determine who remains with the organization and who is forced to look elsewhere. The competition at quarterback, running back, offensive line, and throughout the defense is shaping up to be one of the most intriguing storylines of the offseason. Some players will emerge, some players will surprise, and some names that currently seem secure may not be wearing black and gold when the regular season finally begins. The next several weeks could completely reshape the roster, and Steelers fans will be watching every development closely to see who rises to the occasion and who falls short when the pressure reaches its highest point. There is another layer to this entire discussion that Steelers fans should keep in mind, and it's something that often gets overlooked during the offseason. Not every player who fails to make the initial 53-man roster is necessarily gone for good. In fact, many of the names we've discussed could remain part of the organization's plans even if they don't survive the final round of cuts. That's especially true for younger players with developmental upside. The Steelers have consistently valued player development, and when a prospect shows enough promise, the practice squad often becomes the next step rather than the end of the road. That reality could apply to several players currently fighting for their futures. Take someone like Robert Spillane Jennings. The physical tools are evident. The speed stands out. The challenge has always been refining the details of his game. If Pittsburgh believes those improvements can come with more coaching and more time, keeping him within the organization could make a lot of sense even if he doesn't initially crack the active roster. The same logic applies to Gabriel Rubio. Defensive linemen often require time to develop, especially after dealing with injuries. The transition to the NFL is demanding for any young player, but it can be even more difficult for linemen who must adjust to stronger, faster, and more technically refined competition every single week. If Rubio shows flashes during camp but isn't quite ready for a full-time role, the Steelers could still view him as a long-term investment. That possibility makes every preseason game incredibly important. For veterans, the situation is often different. Players such as Dean Lowry and Ryan McCollum are not necessarily being evaluated on future potential. Their evaluations are happening in the present. Coaches already know what those players are. The question becomes whether their experience and reliability outweigh the flexibility or upside offered by younger alternatives. That's where roster construction becomes a fascinating balancing act. A team cannot be built entirely around potential. At the same time, a franchise must continuously prepare for the future. The Steelers are trying to compete right now while also developing the next generation